My boyfriend and I bought a house on the outskirts of the city, about 30 minutes away. 20 minutes further was an old army base where a lot of kids and young adults would explore. Everyone said it was so creepy, so it was right up my alley. The thing about it was that back in the day, it was used as an army base, with the main headquarters on a tall hill. Below were homes used to house the military families. Also, there was a school, church, recreation hall, and community center down below where the homes were. What made this place so weird was that everything was abandoned, except the homes, which were still being used as low-income housing. To top off the creepiness of it all, every home had a tunnel going from the basement up the hill into the main base. These tunnels were filled with cement, keeping people from using them, but still, it was creepy. My boyfriend had lived there for a brief time with his mom, brother, and 2 sisters when he was about 14. He and his sisters have stories about seeing things in that house, including a small girl running through the hall to their mom's room. When my boyfriend got up to check, it wasn't either of his sisters. They were still in bed, and there was no one in his mother's room. One night, we were at our home with a few friends, sitting around the fire pit, when somebody suggested that we go check out the base. It was around 11 p.m., which was a good time to go. You had to be sneaky about it, because there were still people living at the bottom of the hill, and they would often report you to the police for trespassing. I had never been there, and I was very excited to go. I had heard all the stories, and I wanted to check it out. We all piled into our friend's truck, 5 of us, and headed over. Once we got there, we had our lights turned off and quietly drove into the recreation hall parking lot. We were getting our nerves together to go up the hill. We would have to sneak out of the truck quietly and run up the road until it reached the part that had some good tree coverage. Just then someone said, "Hey, what's that light?" We were all looking up the hill, and through the bushes, we could see a light bouncing around. We would see it for a few seconds, and then it would be gone behind the trees, then back again, and then gone. Finally, it was gone for good. We thought it was weird, but decided to go anyway. Then at the road going up the hill, at the part where the trees cleared, we all saw something. We couldn't decipher what it was. A person, a shadow. We didn't know. It was moving though, and it was coming down the hill towards us. Then we saw it. 3 things. Shadows, people, whatever. These 3 shapes looked a lot like soldiers. They each had what looked like rifles resting on their shoulders as they were walking. It was so dark, and all of us were freaking out. "They look like soldiers," someone said, followed by, "Are they carrying guns?" We were at the army base, and we all seriously considered that they may be 3 ghost soldiers. When they got closer, we realized that they had something on their faces. It was gray and white. As they came closer, we saw that they were skulls. They had skulls for faces. At this point, we were all freaking out. We got close enough for us to realize that they were 3 men. Large men, not ghosts. And they were holding baseball bats over their shoulders, with black hoodies on and skeleton Halloween masks. We all slouched down as much as we could and peeked over the dashboard from behind the back seats. As they came off the base road onto the house roads, they pulled their masks up and lit cigarettes. They were walking back to one of the houses. We were shocked. What on earth were they doing up there? Grown men with baseball bats, dressed like that. It was terrifying. We should have called the police, but I mean, what could we have said? And what proof did we have that they even did anything? I was worried somebody was up there that they had hurt. I also thought they may be protecting something that was up there. But the scariest part about it was thinking what would have happened to us if we ran into them in the abandoned army base. It still gives me chills. Needless to say, when they were out of our sight, we bolted out of there and went home. I still have never seen the army base, and a few years ago, they demolished it. The other buildings below are still there, and the homes are still being used to this day. I went back to check out the other buildings, but could not get inside. As I was walking away, I did see the shadow of a man leaning against the side of a building that you can't get to, and I wasn't the only one seeing him. During the summer of 2016, my boyfriend Andrew and I went on a cross-country road trip. Our plan was to take our time and explore the United States, stopping at motels when convenient. We also had camping gear to use in case there wasn't anywhere to stay. On rare occasions, we would sleep in the car, but we tried to avoid it. With no strict itinerary, we had the freedom to veer off the beaten path. We would take detours whenever something piqued our interest. We had a good GPS, so we felt confident that we wouldn't get lost if we decided to explore, even if it was a really remote area. As we drove along a small highway, our eyes caught sight of what appeared to be an old abandoned building in the distance. It looked like an old shed at first, but as we got closer, more buildings appeared over the horizon. The late-day sun shone down on it. It looked like one of those old West ghost towns that you see on TV sometimes. We were not exactly in that part of the country, but that's what it reminded me of. Andrew, always drawn to the mysterious and unconventional, suggested we take a closer look. It was getting late, but his curiosity got the better of us. We made the impulsive decision to explore the deserted town. As we approached the town, we noticed there were only a few buildings, not exactly a city, more like an abandoned rest stop. It was just a gas station and an old motel, plus 2 houses off in the distance that also appeared to be abandoned. The old buildings stood dilapidated and worn. I couldn't even guess how old they were. The windows were shattered, and the walls were almost falling down. We stepped out of the car and walked around cautiously. The sun began to set, casting long shadows that intensified the town's creepy aura. It was too late to find a motel, so we had accepted that this was it for the night. The buildings were far too dangerous to stay in, so we found a spot and set up camp. Our site was a small clearing surrounded by the crumbling structures. Andrew set up the tent, while I anxiously scanned our surroundings. Nightfall arrived quickly, and it got dark, really dark. We couldn't even see the streetlights from the highway. We were just out of range. The moon's light was almost non-existent. We settled into our tent, planning to do some more exploring in the morning. Andrew, who had done the majority of the driving that day, was dead tired. He fell asleep right away. I, on the other hand, lay awake for a while. Sometime in the dead of night, a faint sound caught my attention. I was still awake. It sounded like people talking. I looked at my phone, and it was 2:30 in the morning. I had no idea who could be out there so late, or why. I peeked my head out of the tent, straining to see in the dark. When my eyes adjusted, I could just barely see 2 shadowy figures standing near our car. They were whispering to each other. I watched for a few minutes, and one of the men walked over to our car door and tried to open the passenger side. As soon as he did that, our car alarm went off. It blared loudly in the empty town, the only sound for miles. Just then, Andrew sprung up and asked me what was going on. He must have thought that I set it off. I told him what I saw, and then we looked back, and the men were gone. I didn't know where they were, or if they had seen our tent. Andrew and I quickly got dressed and put on our shoes. We bolted for the car. When we got there, we looked around, and we couldn't see the men anywhere. We knew that as soon as we turned off the alarm, then our presence would be known. We did it anyway, then got into the car and started the engine. We didn't even bother to pack up the tent. As we drove back to the highway, we were shaking with fear. On our way out, our lights fell upon 2 men walking at the side of the road. One of them clutched a crowbar, while the other had a firearm. I couldn't tell much about them, but when our headlights hit them, they simply stared, as if they weren't doing anything wrong, even though I'm pretty sure they were about to steal our car. We continued our trip from there, but we made sure to stay somewhere safe every night. We never went back for our tent. I'm sure it would make for an ominous scene for whoever stopped there next. An abandoned ghost town, with an old tent all set up, the door flap wide open. It would look like a monster got us or something. That could be a pretty good scary story on its own. This happened almost 10 years ago, during my first year of college. I stayed in the student residences at the time. The campus was very modern. Most buildings were glass from floor to ceiling, with the exception of a few. However, there was one structure that stood out. A decrepit old building. It was 5 floors and made of red brick. It wasn't a particularly beautiful building, probably the reason it was allowed to fall into disrepair. It was surrounded by a tall fence. I think they were going to knock it down and put a new building there. There were a few other construction projects on campus at the time. Our school was expanding quickly. This dilapidated building, with broken windows and worn walls, captured my curiosity from the very first day. One evening, I convinced some of my friends to come with me and explore the old building. I went with my roommate James and one of our other friends Tim. As we approached the desolate building, none of us were scared. We were laughing and talking as normal. It was more of an adventure than anything else. If anything was scary about it, it was the possibility of getting caught and being in trouble. The building was on the other side of campus from our residence. On the way, we passed a campus police officer. He looked over to us suspiciously, but didn't say anything. We just kept walking. When we got close, we circled the area a few times, trying not to look suspicious. Eventually, we approached the old building. An orange plastic construction fence encircled the structure. We found a gap in the fence and slipped inside. Warning signs were all over the place that cautioned against trespassing. Some emphasized the danger, others were about the legal consequences. We went in anyway. None of us wanted to look scared. We walked through the old classrooms, stripped of all desks and furniture. The place was pitch dark other than the light coming from our phones. We were still on the ground floor, but soon we had seen everything there was to see, so we went up the stairs. The second floor was more of the same, empty rooms and dirty hallways. It wasn't as exciting as we were expecting. The 3 of us were getting bored, and we were about to leave. Nobody really wanted to bother with the other floors. Suddenly, we heard something. A faint sound. It sounded like footsteps. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was someone else in the building. My first thought was that it was the campus police officer who saw us, and we were about to get in trouble, maybe expelled. The footsteps grew louder, and it became clear that they were coming from above, not below. That meant whoever it was must have been there already. There was no way that the officer could have gotten up the stairs without us noticing. Panic began to take hold of us. We were about to make a run for it, but that's when we looked over down the hallway and we saw the shadow of a man blocking our path. I looked over to James. He didn't have any words. A few long seconds passed, and the dark figure just stood there in the middle of the hallway. We were about 50 feet away. Our phone lights pointed at the ground. I raised my light up and pointed it at the figure. It was a man, probably a few years older than us. He wore dirty clothes and had an angry look on his face. We all knew right away that the man was living in this building, or at least crashed there from time to time. None of us spoke. The man's expression said it all. We needed to get out of there. We ran in the opposite direction, not sure if there was another way out. Most buildings that size have more than one staircase. Luckily, we found another way down. When we made it out of the building, we peeked around the corner and saw the campus security off in the distance. He was far enough away that we were safe. When we got out of the fenced-off area, we went over to a spot just off campus, where students would go to smoke cigarettes or other stuff. We stayed there for about half an hour while we calmed down. We didn't want security to see us coming out of that building. We never reported what we saw, because then we would have to admit to going in ourselves. The building stood there for my entire first year and part of my second year. Every time I looked at it, I wondered if that guy was still there. I also wondered if he was alone. It's hard to believe that they weren't able to keep people from squatting there. My best guess is that campus security is just really lazy. I mean, we got away with it. I live in a neighborhood. Well, it's more of a highway with houses at the side of the road. I wouldn't recommend walking there, since there are no sidewalks. I wish I had given myself that warning 2 years ago. I had some friends with me at the time, a boy and 2 girls. Let's call the boy Dan, and girl 1 will be called Sarah. Girl 2 will be called Hazel. We liked exploring forests and abandoned structures and such. One day, we decided to explore an abandoned house that was at the very end of my neighborhood, so we started walking. We avoided the road by walking on the tall grass, which was very unpleasant. It caused us to walk on the edge of the road. We reached the house. It was built in the 1940s, and it was owned by a man who abandoned it after moving into a nursing home. This was in the 80s though, and the house had been left alone ever since. We were outside for a little while, and Dan said that we should go in. I was excited, but Sarah was not very happy. She sat on the moldy wooden staircase and had to process everything before she went in. I can't blame her. What if there were squatters inside, about to ambush us? Hazel comforted her, and Dan walked to the back of the house where there was a well. We decided to check out the well. It was stone and round, and it looked kind of like the one in the movie The Ring. There was a piece of old wood covering the top, and Dan decided to be super reckless. He stomped on the wood like a maniac, and his leg fell through the small opening. If he would have fallen in, we would have been in big trouble. He lifted his leg out of the opening, and acted like nothing happened. I couldn't imagine how he could be so calm. He almost fell down a well, with what I saw were sharp rocks at the bottom, and he just brushed it off. We got a little carried away, and started throwing random stuff down the well. Figurines, rocks, fake flower pots, etc. Then we went inside the house. When we got in, a very strong odor emitted from the door. It didn't smell just like an old house, it smelled like a plumbing accident. It was very gross, but the smells aside, we came across a bunch of weird things. Clothes packed in a freezer, a fireplace with dolls inside, an upside-down table. It kind of looked like an art museum. We were very happy to find lots of vintage things in every cabinet and drawer. Things began to get kind of eerie though. We entered the bedroom, and the roof was caved in. Clothes with stains everywhere, and worst of all, a black ooze was lined across the ceiling. I thought I was going to vomit at this point. We also heard some distinct chewing sound. When we left the room, we froze. We saw a shadow at the corner of the door, but it was fast. It bolted back into the other room that it came from. We heard a huff, followed by a cough, which should have been enough for us to leave the house, but being the dumb kids that we were, we stayed. Eventually we left, but hung around outside for a while. Here's the part that gives me nightmares to this day. A man who wore a scruffy lime green shirt, all dirty, with old gym shorts, opened the front door. We froze in shock. Who was this man, and how did we not notice him when we were inside? The mood turned from scary to horrific when he lifted his arm to reveal a chunk of raw meat where his skin used to be. There was blood still dripping down from his arm. We wondered if that was the chewing sound that we heard. Then we heard a neighbor shout, "Get the F out of here," and we ran for it. I haven't told my parents. I don't want to be lectured again for doing things that could have killed me and harmed other people around me. I haven't heard anything about that house ever since, but I want to know why he was there in the first place. I can't imagine what he would have done to us if we were caught.